For 7 years, I stood behind Seraphina Cross like a wall that had learned to breathe, and I never once asked her to notice me. She was the heiress of the Cross Group, the youngest board chairman the company had ever crowned, and the kind of beautiful that made grown executives forget the numbers they had walked into the room to defend. I was the man who carried her coat, remembered her allergies, and rewrote the contracts her lawyers were too slow to catch. People at those galas assumed I was staff. And I let them, because being invisible beside her felt, for a long time, like being chosen. I want you to understand what that devotion actually looked like, because it matters for everything that came after. When she had insomnia, I learned to brew 3 different teas and tested them on myself first to know which one settled the nerves fastest. When a rival firm tried to bury her with a leaked memo, I sat awake until 4 in the morning building the counter-evidence that saved her reputation by sunrise. She never thanked me with words, only with the small permission of letting me stay one more day. And I told myself that her cold silence was simply the shape her gratitude took. Let me give you the full shape of those 7 years, because the size of the cage explains the size of the freedom that followed. I had been a promising analyst. When the Cross family first hired me, a young man with his own ambitions and a future that belonged entirely to himself. Then I met Seraphina at a strategy meeting, watched her dismantle 3 senior executives with 4 sentences, and made the fatal mistake of believing that a woman that brilliant must have a warmth hidden somewhere beneath the frost. I decided, with the arrogance of a man who thinks love is a renovation project, that I would be the one to find that warmth and bring it into the light. So I made myself indispensable, one sacrifice at a time, until indispensability became the only identity I had left. I memorized her preferences the way scholars memorize scripture, the exact angle she liked her chair, the precise number of minutes she needed alone before negotiation, the foods that soured her stomach, and the songs that loosened her shoulders. I gave up my own apartment in a good neighborhood for a closet near her penthouse so I could respond to her summons within minutes. I turned down a promotion at another firm, a real one, the kind that builds a career because accepting it would have meant fewer hours within reach of her shadow. My own friends drifted away during those years because a man who cancels every dinner eventually stops being invited to dinner. My family stopped asking when I would visit, because the answer was always the same exhausted apology delivered through a phone I was too tired to hold properly. I watched my 20s dissolve into a single repeating day of anticipating one woman's needs, and I called the dissolution loyalty, and I wore the loyalty like a medal I had pinned through my own skin. The terrible thing is that I was good at it. Genuinely, world-class good. And being the best at your own erasure is a special kind of trap. The night everything broke was supposed to be her engagement announcement, and like a fool I believed the announcement was about us. The Cross Group had rented the entire rooftop terrace of the Meridian Tower, 300 guests in tailored darkness, champagne towers catching the city lights like frozen waterfalls. I had spent 2 weeks coordinating that event down to the temperature of the appetizers, because I assumed I was building the stage for my own proposal. I had the ring in my breast pocket, warm from my own heartbeat, and I kept touching it through the fabric like a man confirming a wound. Seraphina took the microphone at exactly 9 o'clock, and the crowd hushed the way crowds do when money is about to speak. She looked magnificent under the lights, ice-white gown, sapphires at her throat, that I had personally retrieved from the vault that afternoon. Then she smiled the smile I had mistaken for love 1,000 times, and she said the words that would eventually unmake her entire world. "Tonight," she announced, "I want to introduce the man I will marry. The only man who has ever truly understood me, Julian Vance." The crowd turned toward a tall figure stepping out of the shadows near the bar, and my stomach dropped through 7 floors of certainty. Julian Vance was her childhood favorite, the heir of a competing dynasty, the man she had supposedly cut ties with years ago when his family nearly ruined hers. He walked toward her with the lazy confidence of someone collecting a prize he had always assumed was reserved for him, and he draped his arm across her shoulders, as if my 7 years had been nothing more than a coat check ticket. I stood frozen near the edge of the terrace, holding a tray of nothing, feeling 300 strangers slowly remember that I existed. Someone near the front actually laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, because the joke had finally landed and the joke was me. Seraphina found my eyes across the crowd, and for one suspended second I waited for her to explain, to apologize, to tell me this was some elaborate misunderstanding I had failed to catch. Instead, she lifted her chin with that familiar Arctic calm and spoke loud enough for the microphone to carry it. Daniel, be a dear and bring Julian a drink. You're so good at making yourself useful. The laughter spread like spilled wine across a white floor, and something inside my chest that had been load-bearing for 7 years finally cracked all the way through. I looked at the ring in my pocket, then at the woman I had bled myself dry for, and I understood with terrible clarity that she had never seen a man standing behind her, only a tool she had not yet bothered to set down. The strange part, the part I still cannot fully explain, is that the heartbreak burned for only a moment before something colder and cleaner replaced it. I felt a door slam shut somewhere deep beneath my ribs, and for the first time in 7 years, the noise of needing her went completely silent. Make it yourself, I said, and my voice carried farther than I expected across that suddenly quiet terrace. Seraphina blinked, because she had never once heard me refuse her anything. Julian laughed and stepped forward, eager to perform dominance for his new audience, and he shoved my shoulder hard enough to send the empty tray clattering across the marble. She said, "Fetch, dog," he sneered, drawing his fist back to teach me a lesson in front of everyone who had ever underestimated me. His punch came fast and cruel, aimed straight at my jaw, carrying every ounce of his contempt behind it. I did not move, because some exhausted part of me had stopped caring what happened to my body. The fist connected with the air a hair's breadth from my face, and then something impossible happened that I would spend weeks trying to understand. Julian's own punch reversed course mid-strike, as if an invisible mirror had risen between us, and his knuckles cracked backward into his own nose with the full force he had intended for me. He dropped to the marble screaming, blood pouring between his fingers, while 300 guests gasped and surged backward in confusion. Nobody had seen me touch him, because I had not touched him, and the impossibility of it hung over the terrace like the silence before thunder. I stared down at my own hands, then at the broken man bleeding on the floor she had rented for her betrayal, and I felt a single line of text bloom across my vision, like cold fire written on glass. Passive skill unlocked. Absolute reflection. Any malice, deception, or aggression directed at the host returns instantly and physically to its source. I read those words 3 times while Julian sobbed, and Seraphina stood frozen with her perfect mouth slightly open. I did not understand the mechanism. I did not understand the rules, but I understood the meaning the way you understand a sunrise without studying astronomy. For 7 years I had absorbed every cruelty aimed at me and called it love, and now the universe itself had decided the absorbing was over. Whatever they sent at me would simply come home to roost, and I would not have to lift a single finger to make it happen. "Daniel, what did you do to him?" Seraphina demanded, but underneath the command I heard a thread of fear that I had never once heard in 7 years. "Nothing," I answered honestly, straightening my jacket with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "I didn't do anything at all. That's rather the point now, isn't it?" I turned and walked toward the elevator while Julian writhed and the crowd parted around me like I had become contagious. Seraphina called my name twice, sharp and then desperate, but I had spent 7 years answering that voice, and I was done answering it forever. The elevator doors closed on the most beautiful disaster I had ever loved, and I rode down 40 floors feeling lighter with every passing number. By the time I reached the street, the ring was already in a trash bin near the lobby, and the city air tasted like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. I expected to feel hollow that night, and instead I slept for 11 hours straight for the first time in 7 years. When I woke in my small apartment, the one she had never visited because it embarrassed her, the morning light came through the blinds and clean gold bars across the floor. I lay there and tested the strange new silence in my chest, prodding the place where my devotion to Seraphina used to live, and I found nothing there but smooth-healed scar tissue. The skill text still floated faintly at the edge of my vision when I focused, patient and waiting, like a loaded promise I had not yet learned to read. My phone held 43 missed calls and a wall of messages, most of them from numbers I recognized as cross-group executives, suddenly very curious about the man who had embarrassed their chairman. One message stood out from an unknown number, and it contained a single line that made me sit up in bed. "I saw what happened on that terrace, and I need to understand it, because what you did is theoretically impossible. Coffee, my expense, name the time. Dr. Vivian Reyes." I did not answer immediately because 7 years of being summoned had taught me to be wary of people who needed something. Instead, I made my own coffee, slowly, savoring the fact that I was brewing it for myself and no one else. And I thought about what kind of life I actually wanted now that the old one was ash. The answer surprised me with its simplicity, because all I wanted was to be left alone long enough to discover who I was without a woman's shadow falling across me. I wanted work that meant something, friends who saw me, and a quiet kind of peace that I had never once been allowed to taste. The cross group fired me by email at 10:47 that morning, which made me laugh out loud in my tiny kitchen. They cited conduct unbecoming and physical assault upon a guest, and they attached a legal threat drafted by lawyers I had personally trained to be more aggressive. I read the threat carefully, noting the deliberate lies woven through every paragraph, the fabricated witnesses, and the manufactured timeline designed to bury me. Then I felt the skill stir at the edge of my mind, warm and almost amused, and I realized something that made me set my coffee down very slowly. The lies were aimed at me, and the skill reflected malice and deception back to its source, and a legal document is nothing but weaponized deception when it is built on lies. I did not know if it would work through paper and distance, but I had a powerful feeling that I was about to find out. I forwarded the threatening email to a journalist I knew, a sharp woman named Priya, who had owed me a favor since I quietly fed her the truth about a cross-group scandal years ago. I attached no commentary, only the original document, and I let the lies travel back toward the people who had written them. 3 days later, the cross-group legal department imploded in a way that the business press could barely explain. The fabricated witnesses they had invented turned out to correspond by pure impossible coincidence to real employees who came forward furious at being named in a lie. The manufactured timeline collapsed when their own server logs, which someone had carelessly altered, flagged the alterations to an auditor and triggered a fraud investigation. 2 senior lawyers were walked out of the building by the end of the week, and the legal threat against me evaporated as if it had never existed. I watched it all unfold from the comfort of a cafe, sipping coffee I had paid for with my own money, marveling at the elegant cruelty of my new gift. I had not lifted a finger, had not made a single call beyond forwarding one email, and yet the architects of my downfall had dismantled themselves with their own tools. The skill did not create new harm out of nothing. I was beginning to understand. It simply returned the exact harm that had been sent, and people who sent a great deal of harm received a great deal back. It was justice without effort, vengeance without involvement, and it left my hands and my conscience perfectly clean. Dr. Vivian Reyes turned out to be exactly the kind of person I had spent 7 years never being allowed to meet. She was a researcher in cognitive anomalies at the City University, brilliant and blunt and entirely uninterested in money or status, and she looked at me across the cafe table like I was the most fascinating equation she had ever encountered. She did not flirt, did not flatter, did not want anything from me except the truth of what had happened on that terrace. For a man who had been used as a tool for 7 years, being seen as a genuine mystery rather than a convenient resource felt almost overwhelming. I had 3 friends at that engagement party, she said, stirring her tea with clinical precision. All 3 described the same thing, a man's punch reversing into his own face with no contact whatsoever. That violates conservation of momentum, which means either 3 reliable witnesses simultaneously hallucinated, or something genuinely new is happening, and I find the second option far more interesting. I studied her, weighing 7 years of hard-won caution against the strange pull of finally being understood by someone. There was no malice in her, none at all, and I noticed that the skill in my mind stayed perfectly quiet in her presence, like a guard dog recognizing a friend. That silence told me more than any words could have, because the skill reacted to ill intent, and its calm meant she had none toward me. I decided slowly and deliberately that I would tell her a version of the truth, because a life rebuilt in total isolation was not a life worth rebuilding. I don't fully understand it myself, I admitted, which was true. But I've stopped being able to be hurt by people who want to hurt me, and the hurt they aim at me goes back to them instead, and I have no idea where the limits are. I watched her eyes light up with the specific joy of a scientist handed an impossible puzzle. I came here because you're the first person in a very long time who wanted to understand something about me rather than use something from me. Vivian smiled then, the first real smile I had seen across that table, and she pulled out a notebook already half filled with hypotheses. Then let's understand it together, she said, carefully with controls, because a power you don't understand is a danger to you and everyone near you. She tapped her pen against the page, already 3 steps ahead. And Daniel, whoever taught you to call 7 years of being used a relationship, they did you a profound disservice, and I'm sorry no one corrected it sooner. Something in my throat tightened at the plain kindness of it. The casual way she named the wound I had spent years pretending was a gift. I had expected to spend the rest of my life alone with this strange power, and instead I had found, in the wreckage of my old existence, the beginning of something that felt suspiciously like a friend. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, about science and power and the strange architecture of cruelty, and when we finally parted I realized I had not thought about Seraphina Cross even once. Seraphina, meanwhile, was beginning to discover exactly how much of her world I had been quietly holding up. I did not learn the details until later, but I pieced them together from the press, from Priya, and from the increasingly frantic messages that began arriving on my phone. The morning after the engagement disaster, the Cross Group's quarterly board meeting descended into chaos because the briefing documents that I had always prepared simply did not exist. Seraphina walked into that boardroom armed with nothing, because she had never realized that her legendary preparedness had a name, and the name was Daniel. For 7 years I had anticipated every question before it was asked, every objection before it was raised, every weakness in every deal before a rival could exploit it. The board had come to believe that Seraphina Cross was a strategic genius who never missed a detail, and in a sense they were right, except the details had all been mine. Without me feeding her the answers through an earpiece, without my midnight memos and my exhaustive contingency plans, she stood exposed before 15 skeptical directors who suddenly saw a young woman badly out of her depth. She bluffed because bluffing was the only weapon she had left, and the bluff held for exactly 1/4 before the cracks began to show. I learned the specifics of that first catastrophic board meeting from Priya, who had cultivated sources inside the company faster than anyone I knew. Seraphina had walked in expecting the documents to simply be there, the way they had always been there, the way Heir is there until suddenly it is not. When the lead director asked about the projected exposure on the Hartwell merger, she reached for an answer that did not exist, because I was the one who had always run those projections at 2 in the morning. She gave a number, a confident number, an entirely invented number, and the director who had actually done his homework caught the lie within seconds. The room turned on her with the slow patience of predators who have finally smelled blood on something they had long believed untouchable. They began asking the questions they had never dared ask before, the questions whose answers I had always supplied in advance, and Seraphina drowned in real time before 15 pairs of cold, appraising eyes. She had built her entire authority on the appearance of omniscience, and the appearance had been me, and now the appearance walked out of the building 40 floors below and rode away into a life of his own. By the time she left that boardroom, the directors had already begun, quietly, to plan for a future that did not include her. Julian Vance, her new fiancé, proved to be precisely the kind of man who looks impressive until you need him for something real. He had charm and a famous surname and absolutely no capacity to do the invisible work that keeps an empire standing. When Seraphina turned to him for the kind of support I had given without being asked, he offered confidence in place of competence and excuses in place of results. The deals I would have salvaged began to slip away, the rivals I would have outmaneuvered began to circle, and the careful machine of the Cross Group started to grind itself apart from the inside. The first time she called me directly, 8 days after the terrace, I almost did not recognize her voice. The Arctic Command was still there on the surface, but underneath it ran a current of something I had never heard from her in 7 years, and it took me a moment to identify it as fear. "Daniel, there's been a misunderstanding," she said, in the tone of a queen who has decided to be magnanimous toward a peasant. "You were emotional. You overreacted, and I'm prepared to forgive the scene you caused if you return to your position by Monday." I listened to her reframe my heartbreak as my failure, my freedom as my tantrum, and I felt nothing but a distant clinical interest in the performance. "Seraphina," I said calmly, "I don't work for you anymore, and I don't love you anymore, and those are two separate facts that happen to both be true." I could hear her breath catch on the other end of the line because she had clearly expected the old reflex of obedience to do her work for her. I hope you find someone to carry your coat. I genuinely do. It just isn't going to be me. I hung up before she could deploy the next tactic, and I blocked the number a moment later, and I went back to the experiment Vivian and I had scheduled for that afternoon. The strange thing was that I felt no triumph in refusing her, no petty satisfaction, only the clean relief of a man who has finally set down a weight he had carried so long he forgot it was heavy. Let her face the consequences of her own choices, I thought. The universe had appointed itself my advocate, and I had decided to let it work. The experiments with Vivian became the anchor of my new life, and through them I learned the shape and the limits of absolute reflection. We discovered that the skill responded to intent, not to action, which meant that an accidental collision did nothing while a deliberate shove rebounded with full force. We discovered that lies told about me, not merely to me, also reflected, though the effect traveled more slowly and more strangely through the world. And we discovered, most importantly, that the skill could not be tricked, because it read the truth of intention beneath whatever mask a person wore. Vivian designed each test with meticulous care, because she understood instinctively that a power like mine could ruin an innocent person who simply misjudged a moment. We never tested it on the unsuspecting, only on ourselves and on volunteers who knew exactly what they were agreeing to. One afternoon, she asked a colleague to genuinely try to deceive me about a trivial matter, a hidden coin under one of 3 cups, and we watched the colleague's own certainty collapse into confusion the instant the deception formed. He guessed wrong about his own hidden coin, laughing in bewilderment, and Vivian filled 3 pages with notes, while I marveled at the gentleness of it. We mapped the boundaries patiently, the way careful people map a coastline they intend to live beside for a long time. We learned that intensity mattered, that a mild irritation rebounded as a mild inconvenience, while a genuine desire to destroy rebounded as genuine destruction. We learned that the skill could distinguish a joke from a threat, a clumsy accident from a deliberate cruelty, a hard truth spoken in love from a soft lie spoken in malice. Vivian found this last discovery the most astonishing, because it meant the power was not reading my body or my surroundings, but the actual moral weight of intention itself, a thing science had always insisted could not be measured. "It judges," she said one evening, awe creeping into her usually clinical voice. "Not your judgment, not mine, but something deeper and more consistent than either. A surgeon could cut you open with a blade, and nothing would happen, because the intent is to heal. A mugger could threaten you with the same blade and lose a finger to it, because the intent is to harm. The skill knows the difference between the two. Instantly, perfectly, every time." She set down her pen and looked at me with something close to reverence. "Daniel, you're carrying a piece of pure moral law inside your chest, and it doesn't make mistakes, and I don't think you understand yet how extraordinary and how lonely that's going to make you." I did understand the loneliness, or I came to understand it, because a man who cannot be deceived learns terrible things about the people who try to deceive him. But I also understood the gift hidden inside the burden, because for the first time in my life, I could trust the silence of the skill the way other people trust their instincts. When it slept, I was safe. When it stirred, I had been targeted. It became a sense more reliable than sight, a permanent, honest answer to the oldest human question of whether the person before me wished me well or ill. "It's almost merciful when the malice is small," she observed, capping her pen thoughtfully. "A petty lie returns as petty misfortune, a stubbed toe, a forgotten word, a guess gone wrong. But Daniel, I think the scale is proportional, and that frightens me, because it means a person who tries to truly destroy you will be truly destroyed, and they'll have done it entirely to themselves." She looked at me with the serious eyes of a friend rather than a researcher. "You have to be careful who you let aim their worst at you. Not for your sake, but because you'll have to watch what comes back." I understood her warning, and I took it seriously, because I had no desire to become a man who collected ruined enemies like trophies. The beauty of the skill, the reason it sat so easily on my conscience, was that I never chose the harm and never delivered it. I simply existed, lived my life, treated people decently, and the only ones who suffered were the ones who chose to attack a man minding his own business. I could walk through the world doing no harm whatsoever, and the world would punish exactly those who tried to harm me, and there was a terrible clean justice in that arrangement that I found I could live with. The reflections in those early weeks taught me the dark comedy of my own power, because the ghosts of my old life kept arriving to test it. The first was Marcus Webb, a cross-group executive who had spent years taking credit for my work in front of Seraphina. He came to my new cafe with a smile like a knife and an offer that was really a trap, a fake consulting contract designed to lock me into an unpayable debt and drag me back under the company's thumb. He slid the document across the table, certain of his own cleverness, and asked me to sign on the line he had carefully mislabeled. I read the contract slowly, watching the lies stack up paragraph by paragraph, and I felt the skill wake with what I can only describe as amusement. "Marcus," I said pleasantly, "I'm not going to sign this." He pushed harder, lying about the terms, lying about the consequences, lying with the practiced ease of a man who had built a career on deception aimed at people too tired to fight back. Each lie left his mouth aimed at me, found no purchase, and turned around to go home, and I simply sipped my coffee and waited. Marcus left that cafe convinced he had failed to trick me, and he was right. But the failure was only beginning. Within a week, the elaborate web of lies he had spun across his entire career began, impossibly to unravel all at once. The fraudulent expense reports he had filed for years triggered an audit because the numbers he had falsified suddenly stopped reconciling in ways no accountant could explain. The colleagues he had betrayed received anonymous documents proving his betrayals, documents that seemed to assemble themselves out of his own carelessly archived emails. Marcus Webb, who had aimed a lifetime of deception at me in a single afternoon, watched his lifetime of deception come due in a single catastrophic month. He was not the last to try, because the cross group was full of people who had grown fat on cruelty toward the powerless. A woman named Delia, who had once gotten an intern fired for a mistake that was actually hers, attempted to spread a rumor that I had stolen company secrets. The rumor traveled outward, found no truth to attach to in me, and rebounded into her own life, where her own buried secrets began surfacing in the exact venues where she had planted her lies about me. A man named Foster, who had physically intimidated junior staff for years, tried to corner me in an elevator with a threat, and walked out of that elevator having somehow thrown out his own back reaching for my collar. Each incident played out like a scene from a comedy written by a universe with a very dry sense of humor. The schemers schemed, the plots launched, and then the plots curved gracefully through the air and landed squarely on the people who had launched them. I never raised my voice, never threw a punch, never told a lie of my own, and yet my enemies dropped one after another like dominoes knocking themselves over. Vivian started keeping a log of the incidents, half for science and half because, as she admitted, watching bad people defeat themselves was the most satisfying entertainment she had ever found. "It's almost too perfect," she said one evening, reviewing her notes with a glass of wine. "If a novelist wrote these outcomes, an editor would call them unrealistic. And yet here they are, documented, repeatable, absurd. The man who tried to break your back broke his own. The woman who tried to ruin your name ruined hers. There's a moral physics to it that I genuinely cannot stop studying." She looked at me over the rim of her glass with a grin. "Do you understand how rare it is to watch justice operate with the reliability of gravity? Most of us go our whole lives never seeing the wicked actually trip over their own wickedness." My new life began to take a shape I actually recognized as my own. Vivian introduced me to her circle, a loose constellation of researchers and artists and small business owners who valued curiosity over status. They invited me to dinners where no one cared about net worth, only about whether you were interesting and kind, and for the first time in 7 years, I learned what it felt like to be liked for myself. I took a consulting job helping a struggling nonprofit untangle its finances, work that used my real skills toward something that mattered, and the gratitude of the people I helped felt nothing like the cold permission Seraphina had once doled out. I rented a better apartment, one with morning light and room to breathe, and I filled it with things I actually liked, rather than things that would impress a woman who never visited. I started running again in the mornings, rebuilding a body that 7 years of self-neglect had quietly worn down. I read books for pleasure, cooked meals for friends, and slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who owes nothing to anyone. The skill faded into the background of my days, a quiet guardian I rarely thought about, because the people in my new life had no malice to reflect. The dinners at Vivian's apartment became the center around which my whole new world turned. There was Tomas, a sculptor who argued passionately about everything and apologized for none of it, and who treated my opinions as worth fighting over rather than worth ignoring. There was Aisha, who ran a bookshop that lost money every year and kept it open anyway, because a neighborhood needs a place to be quiet in. There was old Professor Lindqvist, who had retired from 3 universities and could not stop teaching, and who asked me questions about myself that no one had asked in a decade. They folded me into their gatherings without ceremony, as if a place had always been waiting, and they were merely surprised I had taken so long to fill it. I remember one particular dinner, maybe 3 months into my new life, when something inside me finally clicked all the way back into place. We were crowded around Vivian's too small table. The food was burned at the edges and perfect anyway, and Tomas was telling an outrageous story about a gallery owner who had tried to cheat him. The whole table was laughing, and someone refilled my glass without my asking, and I realized with a small shock that I had not thought about being useful even once all evening. No one needed me to anticipate anything, to fix anything, to earn my seat by performing my own erasure. I was simply there, a person among persons, wanted for nothing but my presence. The realization moved through me like warmth through cold hands, almost painful in its sweetness. For 7 years I had believed that the price of belonging was disappearing, that I could only earn a place by making myself indispensable and invisible at the same time. And here, at a burnt dinner with people who own nothing impressive, I was learning that real belonging asked the opposite, that it wanted me visible, opinionated, flawed, fully present. I had to excuse myself for a moment because my eyes had unexpectedly filled, and Vivian followed me into the kitchen and simply stood beside me without asking what was wrong, which was somehow exactly the right thing to do. "It gets easier," she said quietly, handing me a glass of water. "The first time you notice you're happy, it can knock the wind out of you, especially if you spent a long time believing you weren't allowed to be. But it gets easier, Daniel. You get to keep this. Nobody's going to send you a bill for it." She bumped my shoulder gently with hers. "Now come back to the table because Tomas is about to get to the part where he glued the gallery owner's car keys to the ceiling, and you do not want to miss it." I went back to the table and I laughed until my ribs hurt, and that night I understood that I had not merely escaped a cage, I had found a home. The contrast was almost too sharp to hold in my mind at once. 7 years of being needed by a woman who never once saw me, traded in a single shattering night for a circle of people who saw me clearly and asked for nothing but my company. I had thought losing Seraphina would leave a wound that defined the rest of my life. Instead, it had simply removed a stone that had been crushing the man underneath. And the man, it turned out, had been alive the whole time, just waiting. Seraphina's unraveling, by contrast, accelerated with every passing week. The Cross Group lost a major government contract because the proposal lacked the obsessive thoroughness that had once been its signature, and the press began to whisper that the young chairman had lost her edge. A rival firm, sensing weakness, launched a hostile acquisition maneuver that the old Seraphina, armed with my contingency plans, would have crushed in an afternoon. The new Seraphina, armed with Julian's confidence and her own desperation, fumbled the defense badly and watched her stock price slide 11% in a single brutal week. There was a particular incident during this period that captured the whole black comedy of my situation better than any other. A consortium of 3 cross-group executives, the same men who had spent years feeding on the company I had quietly kept alive, decided that I must be the secret cause of the collapse. They reasoned, in the way that guilty men always reason, that the disaster could not possibly be their own incompetence, and so they concocted a plan to discredit me publicly and reclaim their stolen credibility. They arranged a press conference, invited business journalists, and prepared to unveil fabricated evidence that I had embezzled millions during my years of service. The press conference was a masterpiece of self-destruction that I almost wished I could have watched in person. The 3 executives took the stage with their forged documents and their rehearsed accusations, each lie aimed squarely at my name and my history. The first executive began reading the charges, and his voice cracked as the words left his mouth, and he found himself stammering details that contradicted his own previous statements. The second tried to rescue the moment by producing the falsified ledger, and the ledger, under the bright lights and the zooming cameras, displayed alterations so clumsy that a junior reporter spotted them from the third row. By the time the third executive attempted damage control, the entire fabrication had inverted itself before a room full of cameras. The journalists, smelling a far better story than the one they had been promised, began asking pointed questions about who had actually authorized the documents I had supposedly forged. The answers all led back to the three men on the stage, whose own signatures appeared on the very transactions they were trying to pin on me. The press conference designed to destroy me ended with the three executives fleeing the stage while reporters shouted questions about their own embezzlement, and by morning, all three were under investigation. I watched the footage that evening with Vivian and our friends, and the apartment filled with the helpless laughter of people witnessing something gloriously absurd. Tomas kept rewinding to the moment the ledger betrayed its forger, howling each time. Aisha declared it better than any film she had seen all year. And I sat among them, the supposed mastermind who had done nothing but exist, marveling once again at the moral physics that governed my new life. I had not attended that press conference, had not spoken to a single journalist, had not lifted one finger against those three men. They had aimed their cruelty at me, and the cruelty had simply gone home, the way water finds the sea. I heard about it the way everyone did, through the business news, and I felt a flicker of something that was not quite pity and not quite satisfaction. I had built so much of what was now collapsing, and watching it fall was like watching a house I had once lived in burn from a safe distance. But I reminded myself that I had offered her my whole self for 7 years, and she had set me on fire in front of 300 people for the entertainment of a man with a famous name. Whatever was burning now, she had lit the match herself, and I owed her nothing but the freedom I had finally claimed. The first sign that Seraphina was crossing from desperation into obsession came when Vivian mentioned, casually over lunch, that a woman matching Seraphina's description had been asking questions about me at the university. My new friends began to report strange encounters, people inquiring about my schedule, my address, my relationship with Vivian. Seraphina had clearly realized that simple commands would not bring me back, and she had pivoted to a more frightening strategy, one built on surveillance and pursuit. The woman who had never once chased anything in her gilded life was suddenly, frantically chasing me. What followed over the next months was a slow, frightening transformation that I watched with a mixture of pity and alarm. The Seraphina who had ruled boardrooms with a glance dissolved by degrees into something I barely recognized, a creature of pure thwarted need wearing the expensive clothes of a life that no longer existed. She abandoned her own dignity the way she had once abandoned me, casually, completely, as if it had never been worth keeping. The reports filtered back to me through my new friends, through Priya, through the strange grapevine that grows around any genuinely bizarre story, and each report described a woman sinking another fathom into obsession. She began by simply watching, parking her car outside places I frequented, and sitting for hours with the engine off, a silhouette behind fog glass. When the watching failed to summon me back, she escalated to letters, dozens of them, then hundreds, ranging from icy commands to tearful confessions to ramblings that made no sense at all. The handwriting in those letters deteriorated over the weeks, I am told, from the crisp authority of a chairman to the frantic scrawl of someone who had stopped sleeping. She wrote about destiny and debt and ownership, about the 7 years I supposedly owed her, about a version of our history in which she had been the generous benefactor and I the ungrateful charity case. The investigators came next, a parade of them, each hired with money she could no longer truly spare. The first investigator she hired to track my movements developed an inexplicable case of vertigo that made surveillance impossible and quit after a week. The second, assigned to photograph me with Vivian, found that his camera malfunctioned every single time he raised it in my direction, the lens fogging or the shutter jamming or the battery dying without reason. The third simply took her money, watched one of the previous two stumble into absurd misfortune, and wisely decided to refund the fee and never return her calls. The malice she funded would not land, could not land, and every failure convinced her further that I possessed a power she needed to recapture by capturing me. She found my new apartment within 2 weeks of that escalation, and I came home one evening to find her standing outside the lobby in a coat worth more than my monthly rent. She looked different than she had on the terrace, thinner and sharper, with a feverish brightness in her eyes that I had never seen during our 7 years together. The Arctic calm that had defined her was cracking at the edges, replaced by something raw and unstable that made me genuinely uneasy. She had come, she said, to make me understand what I had thrown away, and to remind me that no one would ever value me the way she had. "You think these people are your friends," she said, gesturing with contempt toward the building behind me. "You think that scientist woman cares about you, but she only wants to study you like a specimen. And when she's done, she'll discard you, and you'll come crawling back to the only person who ever truly needed you." Her voice climbed as she spoke, losing the practiced control she had worn like armor for years. "I made you, Daniel. I gave your empty life a purpose, and you owe me 7 years of loyalty that you can't just walk away from." I listened to her rewrite our entire history in real time, casting herself as my savior and my devotion as a debt, and I understood that she genuinely believed it. The terrifying thing about Seraphina was not that she lied to me, but that she had lied to herself so thoroughly that the lie had become her reality. And as her words turned cruel, as the malice in them sharpened into a deliberate attempt to wound me, I felt the skill stir for the first time in weeks. I watched the cruelty leave her mouth, and I watched it find no purchase in me, and I watched it begin its long journey home. The reflection of emotional malice, I would learn, worked differently than the reflection of a physical blow. Seraphina's cruelty did not strike her like a fist, because she had not thrown a fist. She had thrown contempt and manipulation and a poisoned version of love. What came back to her, slowly, over the following days, was the exact emotional violence she had aimed at me, turned inward and amplified by her own unstable mind. She had told me I was worthless without her, and the words rebounded into her own psyche, and she began to believe, with growing terror, that she was worthless without me. I did not see this happen, of course, but Vivian and I tracked it through the increasingly disturbing pattern of Seraphina's behavior. The contempt she had hurled at me curdled into self-contempt that she could not name or escape. The manipulation she had attempted to use on me twisted back into a paranoid certainty that everyone around her was manipulating her. The desperate need she had tried to impose on me, the insistence that I owed her my loyalty, returned to her as a desperate need for me that she could neither satisfy nor silence. Every weapon she aimed at my heart became a wound in her own. Before the threats came the seduction, because Seraphina had spent her whole life believing that desire was a lever she could pull at will. She arrived at my apartment one night in a dress designed to end arguments, having clearly decided that the man who resisted her commands might still surrender to her body. The old me, the me of 7 years ago, would have crumbled at the mere fact of her choosing to want me, would have mistaken the performance for the love I had starved for. But that man had died on the terrace, and the man who opened the door felt only a distant sadness at watching her reach for a tool that had rusted into uselessness. She came close, too close, and she lowered her voice into the register she had once used to make executives forget their own names. She told me she had been wrong, that she wanted me now, that all I had to do was take what she was offering, and the war between us would end in the oldest and sweetest way. And as she spoke, I felt the skill stir, because underneath the seduction lay no genuine desire at all, only calculation, only the cold intent to use my body the way she had used everything else about me. The malice in the manipulation was real, even though it wore the mask of passion, and it found no purchase, and it began its slow return. "This isn't desire, Seraphina," I said gently, stepping back out of her reach. "This is just another scheme wearing a prettier dress, and we both know it. And so does the thing inside me that can tell the difference." I watched the seduction curdle into fury on her beautiful ruined face, watched her realize that the one weapon she had always trusted absolutely had failed her completely. "You don't want me. You've never wanted me. You want the thing I used to do for you, and that thing is gone, and no amount of skin is going to bring it back." She left that night humiliated in a way that commands and threats had never managed to humiliate her, because she had offered her body and been refused on the grounds of honesty itself. The calculation she had aimed at me returned to her as a deepening certainty that she had nothing of value left to offer anyone, that even her beauty, her last reliable currency, had been seen through and set aside. It was perhaps the cruelest reflection of all, and I had not intended it, had only spoken the truth, but the truth aimed back at a liar is its own kind of devastation. She started showing up everywhere, at the cafe where I met Vivian, outside the nonprofit where I worked, in the lobby of my building at odd hours. Each time she came armed with a new manipulation, a new lie, a new attempt to guilt or seduce or threaten me back into her orbit. And each time, the malice she carried found no home in me and traveled back to lodge in her, deepening the obsession, tightening the spiral. She was, in the most literal sense, destroying herself by attacking me, and the more she attacked, the faster she fell. The most dangerous moment came when Seraphina finally turned her malice toward Vivian, having decided that the woman beside me was the obstacle between us. She had learned Vivian's schedule, her route home, the quiet street where she walked alone each evening from the university to the bus. One night, Seraphina waited for her there in the dark, clutching a heavy wrench she had bought for the single purpose of ending the life she believed had stolen mine. I did not know it was happening, was at home cooking dinner for us both, but I have reconstructed it from what Vivian told me afterward, and from the police report that followed. Seraphina stepped out of the shadows and swung the wrench at the back of Vivian's head with the full force of murderous intent. But here the skill revealed a mercy I had not known it possessed, a mercy that I have thought about every day since. The malice in that swing was aimed at Vivian, yes, but it was aimed at Vivian because of me, routed through her to wound me in the deepest possible place, and the skill read the true target beneath the apparent one. The wrench twisted in Seraphina's grip as if struck by an invisible hand, reversed its arc, and cracked across her own shoulder hard enough to shatter the bone and drop her screaming to the pavement. Vivian turned at the sound, saw the woman who had meant to kill her writhing on the ground, and did the thing that told me everything about who she was. She called an ambulance for Seraphina. She knelt beside the woman who had just tried to murder her and kept her still and warm until help arrived, talking to her in the low, steady voice of someone soothing a frightened animal. When she told me about it that night, shaking in my arms in our kitchen, she said the thing I will never forget. "She's not a monster, Daniel," Vivian whispered. "She's a person who became a monster's shape, and the difference matters. Even now, even after this." I held her for a long time that night, understanding how close I had come to losing the only home I had ever truly had. The skill had saved Vivian, had read the architecture of the malice, and routed it back to its source even across the distance between us. But I also understood, with a cold clarity, that Seraphina had crossed from obsession into genuine danger, that the woman I had once loved was now capable of murder. The mercy of the skill had bought us this round, but mercy is not a strategy, and I knew the time for warnings was nearly over. I tried once more to be merciful, because despite everything I'm not a cruel man. I met her in a public park on a gray afternoon, and I spoke to her gently, without contempt, without any malice she could reflect. "Seraphina," I said, "you have to stop, not for my sake, but for yours, because something is happening to you that you don't understand, and every time you come after me it gets worse." I chose my words with surgical care, draining them of any ill will, because I knew that even my anger could become her poison. "Let me go, and the worst of this will stop. I promise you that much." But she could not hear me, because the obsession had already grown louder than reason. She heard my mercy as weakness, my warning as a game, my honesty as another move in a contest she was determined to win. She told me that she would never stop, that she would burn down my new life to prove I belonged to her, that she would destroy Vivian and my friends and my work until I had nothing left but her. And with every threat she made, I felt the skill carry the threat home, and I watched the woman I had once loved sink another inch into the darkness she was building with her own hands. "I will take everything from you," she hissed, gripping my sleeve with fingers gone white. "Everyone you love, everything you've built, I will reduce it all to ashes until you have no choice but to come back to me." "No," I said quietly, removing her hand from my sleeve with the gentleness of genuine pity. "You won't take anything from me. You'll only take it from yourself, over and over, until there's nothing left of you at all. That's the part you still don't understand. And I'm so sorry, because I don't think you ever will. I walked away from her then, across the gray park, and I did not look back even when I heard her begin to scream my name. The screaming followed me to the gate and beyond, ragged and inhuman, the sound of a woman watching her own foundations dissolve and blaming the man who simply refused to be buried with her. I felt the weight of it. I will not pretend I did not, because watching anyone fall apart is a heavy thing, even when they built the fall themselves. But I also felt, beneath the weight, the unshakable certainty that I had warned her, and that what came next was no longer mine to carry. Julian Vance broke first, as men like Julian always do when the famous surname stops being enough. He had married Seraphina for the empire and the prestige, and as both crumbled around him, he began to plot his exit with the clumsy greed of a man who has never had to be clever. His plan was to drain what he could from the failing Cross Group and disappear before the collapse, and somewhere in his small, calculating mind, he decided that I was the obstacle to his clean escape. He had convinced himself that I was secretly orchestrating the company's downfall, and he resolved to eliminate me before I could finish the job. He came for me on a rainy night, with 2 hired men and a plan he had clearly seen in too many films. They cornered me in the parking garage beneath my building, 3 large shapes against the concrete and the falling rain, and Julian wore the ugly confidence of a man who believes violence will solve what charm could not. "You've been pulling strings," he accused, jabbing a finger at my chest, "ruining everything I'm owed, and tonight you're going to learn what happens to people who get in my way." He nodded to his men, and they advanced with the heavy certainty of muscle that has never met something it could not break. I want to be clear that I felt no fear, only a deep and weary sadness at the predictability of it all. I stood still in the center of that garage, my hands at my sides, and I let them come. The first man swung a length of pipe at my head with intent to kill, and the pipe reversed in his grip as if the air itself had grabbed it, and it cracked across his own skull and dropped him senseless to the wet concrete. The second man, halfway through drawing a knife, watched the blade twist in his hand and open a long, shallow cut across his own forearm, and he screamed and fled into the rain before the malice could finish returning to him. Julian stood alone then, his hired courage bleeding out onto the garage floor, and I saw the exact moment the impossibility of it broke through his arrogance. "What are you?" he whispered, backing away. "What did you do? You didn't even move." He raised his own fist anyway, because some men cannot stop swinging even when they have seen the mirror, and his punch came at me carrying every ounce of his hatred and fear. It rebounded the way Julian's first punch had rebounded on the terrace months ago, and his fist drove into his own face, and he went down hard and stayed down, weeping into the rainwater. I crouched beside him, close enough to be heard over the rain, and I spoke without anger because anger would only have hurt him more. "I never pulled a single string, Julian," I told him truthfully. "I've been living my life, helping a nonprofit balance its books, having dinner with people who like me. Everything that's happened to you and Seraphina, you did to yourselves every bit of it, and the sooner you accept that, the sooner the bleeding stops." I stood and looked down at the man who had once draped his arm over my 7 years like a coat. "Go to a hospital, then go somewhere far away, and stop trying to hurt people who never touched you." I left him there in the rain and walked upstairs to my apartment, where Vivian was waiting with dinner and worry in equal measure. I told her what had happened plainly, watching her face move from alarm to relief to that fierce protective anger she reserved for people who threatened the things she loved. She checked me over for injuries she knew I could not have, because old habits of care do not vanish just because a power makes them unnecessary, and the gesture moved me more than any rescue could have. We ate dinner that night with the rain drumming on the windows, 2 people safe inside a life that no amount of malice could breach, and I understood that the garage had been the last gasp of the old world reaching for me. The police found Julian in that garage an hour later, and his attempt to frame me collapsed the moment he opened his mouth, because every lie he told the detectives seemed to circle back and incriminate him instead. The hired man who had fled was caught on a traffic camera and arrested by dawn, and he confessed everything to reduce his own charges. Julian Vance, heir to a dynasty, was arraigned on assault and conspiracy charges by the end of the week, his famous surname doing nothing but ensuring the press covered every humiliating detail. Seraphina did not visit him once, because by then she had eyes only for me. The most elaborate scheme of all came when Seraphina, in a moment of strategic desperation, decided to attack the thing I had built rather than the man who had built it. She funneled the last of her discretionary money into a coordinated assault on the nonprofit where I worked, hiring a public relations firm to manufacture a scandal that would destroy our funding and force me back into the open. The plan was genuinely clever, the kind of plan I might have designed for her in the old days, built on planted documents and bribed sources and a false accusation of embezzlement aimed straight at me. She had finally understood that she could not hurt me directly, so she aimed her malice at me through the institution I loved. The trouble for Seraphina was that the attack was still, at its heart, malice directed at me, routed through a charity, but pointed at my name. The planted documents that were supposed to prove my embezzlement began, during the journalist's verification process, to reveal the fingerprints of the people who had planted them. The bribed sources, when pressed for corroborating detail, found their own carefully rehearsed lies dissolving into accidental confessions that implicated the firm that had paid them. The public relations firm Seraphina had hired watched in horror as their manufactured scandal curved through the air and detonated on their own reputation, and they returned her money and severed the contract within days. But the reflection did not stop at the firm, because the original malice had been hers, and malice always finds its true author eventually. The investigation into the manufactured scandal traced the funding back through 3 shell accounts to Seraphina Cross herself, and the press, already circling her decline like patient vultures, fell upon the story with delight. The headline that ran was the kind of headline that ends a public life: a former heiress caught fabricating crimes against a children's charity to torment an ex-employee. The nonprofit, far from being destroyed, received a flood of sympathetic donations from a public outraged on our behalf, and we ended that quarter with more funding than we had ever had. I remember sitting in my office, reading the news of Seraphina's exposure, and feeling the strange, weightless clarity that the skill always brought. She had tried to burn down the one thing I had built with my own hands and my own heart, and the fire had not even singed us, and the arsonist had set herself alight instead. There was no rage in me as I read it, no gloating, only the quiet recognition that I had warned her, again and again, in a park and in a lobby, and on a gray afternoon. She had chosen the fire every single time, and the fire had finally chosen her back. The acquittal of my old life and the construction of my new one reached a quiet milestone that spring. The nonprofit I had been helping turned its first surplus in a decade, and they offered me a permanent position as their director of operations, a real job with a real purpose that I accepted without hesitation. Vivian published the first cautious paper on what she called anomalous reciprocal causation, carefully scrubbed of my name and identifying details, and it caused a respectful stir in the small world of people who study impossible things. My friendships deepened into the kind of bonds I had never been allowed to form, and my apartment became a place where people gathered rather than a cell where I waited. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary happiness, I realized that what I felt for Vivian had quietly become something more than friendship. It had crept up on me without drama or desperation, nothing like the consuming need I had once felt for Seraphina, but steadier and warmer and entirely my own. Vivian saw me, all of me, the strange power and the wounded history, and the man slowly healing underneath both, and she had never once tried to use any of it. When I finally said something clumsy and honest over a kitchen table littered with research notes, she smiled the real smile I had come to live for, and told me she had been waiting for me to catch up. "I wasn't going to rush you," she said, taking my hand across the table with the easy confidence of someone who had never needed to manipulate a thing. "You spent 7 years being treated like a tool, and a person needs time to remember they're a person before they can love anyone properly." She squeezed my fingers and held my eyes. "Besides, I'm a scientist, and the most interesting results come to those who are patient with the experiment." I laughed and I kissed her, and the skill at the edge of my mind stayed perfectly, beautifully silent, because there was no malice anywhere in that kitchen, only 2 people who had chosen each other freely. That silence had become my truest measure of safety, a quiet that meant I was among people who wish me no harm. With Seraphina, the skill would have screamed. With Vivian, it slept like a contented animal in the sun. The contrast told me everything I had failed to understand, for 7 long years about the difference between being needed and being loved. I want to describe what loving Vivian actually felt like, because it stood in such total opposition to everything that came before. There was no anxiety in it, no constant fear of falling short, no exhausting performance of usefulness to earn another day of permission. She asked nothing of me that she did not freely give in return, and when I did things for her, it was because I wanted to, not because my place depended on it. We built a life out of small, ordinary kindnesses, freely exchanged, and I discovered that real love, unlike the thing I had mistaken for it, made me feel larger rather than smaller. For the first time, I was not a wall holding up someone else's building. I was a person living in a house we were raising together. Seraphina's final descent was a slow-motion catastrophe that I watched from the safe distance I had earned. The Cross Group, stripped of the invisible architecture I had once provided and the contracts Julian had bungled, was acquired in a fire sale by the very rival she had once crushed at my direction. She lost the chairmanship, lost the empire her family had spent generations building, lost the wealth and the status that had defined every moment of her gilded existence. And as each pillar of her old identity collapsed, the obsession with me grew to fill the empty space, until there was nothing left of Seraphina Cross but the hunger to reclaim the man she had thrown away. She had become, by then, exactly what the universe makes of people who refuse to stop attacking a mirror. Her beauty had curdled into something gaunt and frantic, her elegance into the shabby intensity of a woman who has forgotten to eat and sleep. She had spent her fortune hiring people to follow me, only to find that every investigator she sent met some small absurd misfortune that ended the surveillance. The malice she funded simply would not land, and each failure deepened her certainty that I was the key to a power she could not name but desperately wanted to possess again. The last time I saw her, she had stopped pretending to be anything other than what she had become. She intercepted me outside the nonprofit on a bright, ordinary afternoon, and the woman who had once commanded boardrooms with a glance now stood before me trembling and unwashed, clutching a folder of photographs she had taken of my life. "I know your schedule," she said, her voice a frayed thread of its former authority. "I know where Vivian lives. I know where you eat. I know everything, and I will not let you have this life when you abandon the one you owed to me." I looked at her, this ruin of the woman I had loved for 7 years, and I felt the full weight of the tragedy without feeling any guilt for it. "Seraphina," I said softly, "look at what you've done to yourself. Every photograph in that folder, every hour you spent following me, every dollar you spent trying to hurt me, it all came back to you, because that's the only thing that ever could." I did not raise my voice, did not let a single drop of malice into my words, because even now I would not be the source of her suffering. "You did this, not me. I just stopped letting you do it to me, and everything you aimed at me found you instead." For one moment, one fragile, suspended moment, I thought I saw understanding flicker across her devastated face. I thought she might finally grasp the mechanism that had unmade her, the simple, terrible truth that she had destroyed herself by refusing to stop her own cruelty. But the obsession was too deep by then, the spiral too far gone, and the flicker of understanding drowned in the flood of need that had replaced her entire self. She lunged at me, fingers curled into claws, screaming that if she could not have me, then no one would, and the assault carried more raw malice than anything she had ever sent before. It rebounded with a force proportional to its intent, and Seraphina collapsed onto the sidewalk as if she had run full speed into a wall that was not there. She lay there gasping, unhurt in body, but shattered in some deeper place, finally confronting in her own flesh the violence she had been hurling at me for months. People gathered, someone called for help, and I knelt beside her one last time, not as the man who had loved her, but as the man who had survived her. "It's over now," I told her gently. "Please get help, real help. There are people who can pull you back from this, but only if you finally stop reaching for me." Seraphina was committed to a private psychiatric facility 2 weeks later, not by force, but by the exhausted intervention of the few family members who remained. The doctors there had no diagnosis for what truly afflicted her, because the truth was a power they could not measure, but they recognized the obsession and the self-destruction, and they began, slowly, to treat what they could see. I am told she still speaks my name in the long, quiet hours, still believes that if she could only reach me, everything would be restored. I do not visit, because my presence would only feed the thing devouring her, and the kindest gift I can offer her now is my permanent absence. The facility, I later learned, did Seraphina more good than any threat or fortune ever could have. Stripped of the empire and the schemes and the obsessive pursuit, forced into stillness for the first time in her adult life, she began the slow, agonizing work of meeting herself without armor. The doctors could not name what truly ailed her, but they could treat the despair and the fixation, and they could give her the one thing she had never possessed, which was time to sit with the consequences of her own choices. Recovery is not redemption, and I make no claim that she became good, but she became by degrees sane, and sanity for Seraphina meant finally seeing the 7 years for what they had been. I think about her sometimes in the quiet moments, and I have made a kind of peace with the strange justice of it all. I did not punish Seraphina Cross, and I did not punish Julian Vance, and I did not lift a finger against the lawyers or the investigators or the hired men. I simply stopped absorbing the harm that the world aimed at me, and the harm went home, and the people who sent the most received the most. There is a lesson in that I have come to treasure about the difference between vengeance and consequence, between the violence you commit and the violence that merely returns to its rightful owner. There was a temptation I have not yet mentioned, because it tested me more deeply than any of Seraphina's schemes. Word of what I could do, despite Vivian's careful scrubbing of her research, eventually reached people who collect powerful things. A man came to me one afternoon, expensively dressed and softly spoken, representing interest he declined to name, and he offered me a fortune to become a weapon. He explained, with the calm of someone discussing the weather, how a man who could not be harmed and who returned all harm to its sender would be invaluable to the right organization. I could be a shield for the powerful, he said, an unbeatable enforcer, a king among men who feared nothing. I listened to the entire pitch, and I felt the skill stay perfectly silent because the man wished me no harm, only profit, and profit is not malice. When he finished, I declined, and I watched genuine confusion cross his polished face. "You don't understand what you're refusing," he said. "With this power you could rule, you could take anything. No one could ever stop you." I shook my head, and I tried to explain the thing I had learned in the wreckage of my old life. "I spent 7 years being someone's weapon," I told him. "I know exactly what it costs, and I'm never going to be a weapon again, not even my own. The power only works because I do no harm. The moment I weaponize it, I become the thing it's designed to reflect." He left unsatisfied, unable to comprehend a man who would refuse limitless power for the sake of an ordinary life. But I understood something he never would, something the 7 years in the terrace and the long, slow watching of Seraphina's fall had finally taught me. The skill was not a weapon at all. It was a boundary, a simple, unbreakable statement that I would no longer absorb the cruelty of others and call it love or duty or the price of belonging. Used as a weapon, it would have made me a tyrant. Used as a boundary, it made me free. The difference was the whole point, and the man in the expensive suit had no framework for understanding it. I have thought often about why the power came to me on that terrace, in that exact moment, and I have arrived at an answer I cannot prove but believe entirely. It did not come because I was wronged, because the world is full of wronged people who never wake a sleeping skill. It came in the instant I finally chose myself, the instant I refused to fetch Julian his drink, the instant the load-bearing devotion in my chest cracked and let me stand upright for the first time in 7 years. The power was not a reward for suffering. It was the natural shape of a boundary I had been too afraid to draw, made suddenly, impossibly real. The skill remains with me, quiet and patient, a permanent feature of the new life I have built. I rarely think about it now, because I have surrounded myself with people who wish me no harm, and a mirror that reflects malice is invisible in a room with none. I treat people decently. I do my work. I love Vivian and our growing circle of true friends, and the power sleeps. It is only the rare, cruel stranger, the occasional resentful ghost from my old life, whoever discovers that the quiet man minding his own business cannot be harmed without harming themselves first. They learn the lesson quickly, and then they leave, and the quiet returns. Vivian and I married the following autumn in a small ceremony attended by people who actually knew us, with no champagne towers and no 300 strangers, and no microphone for public betrayal. We held it in the garden behind Aisha's bookshop, strung with paper lanterns that Tomas had made by hand, and Professor Lindqvist performed the ceremony after acquiring the necessary credentials online specifically for the occasion. The food was potluck and imperfect and made with love, and not one person there cared about my net worth or Vivian's title or anything except the two people standing under the lanterns choosing each other. It was, in every way that mattered, the precise opposite of the night on the terrace that had ended my old life. She wore a simple dress and a real smile, and when she promised to choose me freely every day for the rest of our lives, the skill in my mind stayed silent as a held breath. I spoke my own vows with a steadiness that surprised me, because I had spent 7 years performing devotion and had forgotten that real love speaks plainly. I promised Vivian no grand sacrifices, no erasure of myself in service of her needs, because I had learned at terrible cost what that kind of love actually was. I promised instead to remain fully myself beside her, to bring my whole presence to our shared life, to give freely and receive freely, and never again mistake disappearing for devotion. Our friends wept and cheered and embraced us, and Tomas gave a toast so long and so heartfelt that he had to stop twice to compose himself. I looked out at the small crowd in that lantern-lit garden, every face turned toward us with genuine joy, and I thought about how I had once stood before 300 strangers and been humiliated for sport. These were not 300. These were perhaps 30. But every single one of them had chosen to be there for me, for us, with nothing to gain and nothing being performed, and 30 true faces outweighed 300 false ones, the way a single warm room outweighs an entire frozen city. I had spent 7 years mistaking a cage for a home, and now I finally understood the difference, because I had felt both in my own chest. The cage had been beautiful and cold, and had nearly killed me slowly. The home was ordinary and warm, and made me more myself with every passing day. The morning of my first wedding anniversary with Vivian, I received one final message from a number I did not recognize. It was from a nurse at Seraphina's facility, sent with the family's permission, and it contained a short note that Seraphina had written during a rare lucid hour. "I understand now," the note read, in handwriting that shook across the page. "I understand what I did, and what I lost, and why it could never come back. I thought I was the wall and you were the shadow. I had it backward the whole time. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry. Be happy. You always deserved to be happy, and I never let you. And that was the only real power I ever had over you, and I wasted it on cruelty." I read the note 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table, where I had first told Vivian I loved her, and I felt something old and heavy finally release inside my chest. I had not needed her apology, had built my entire new life without it, but receiving it anyway closed a door that had been standing quietly ajar for 2 years. I wrote back a single line, drained of all malice, full only of the genuine wish I had carried for her, even through the worst of it. "I forgive you, and I hope you find your way back to yourself. Goodbye, Seraphina." Then I set down the phone, and I walked out onto the small balcony of the home Vivian and I had made, and I watched the morning light spread gold across the waking city. Somewhere out there, the Cross Group was now someone else's empire. Julian Vance was serving his sentence, and Seraphina was slowly, painfully learning to live inside the consequences of her own choices. And here, on this balcony, in this ordinary golden morning, I was simply a man who had survived being used, who had stopped absorbing the cruelty of others, and who had finally built a life out of the one thing Seraphina had never understood was a choice rather than a debt. Vivian came up behind me with 2 cups of coffee, the good kind, brewed by someone who actually wanted to share it. She handed me one and leaned against the railing beside me, and we stood there together in the quiet that meant safety, the quiet of a world that wished us no harm. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, and there was no command in the question, no test, no price attached to the answer. "That I spent 7 years learning the wrong lesson," I said, watching the light, "and that it took losing everything to learn the right one." I turned to look at the woman who saw me, all of me, and who had never once tried to use what she saw. "The right lesson is that the harm you do comes home eventually. but so does the kindness, and a man gets to choose which one he sends out into the world. She smiled, and the skill stayed silent, and the coffee was warm, and for the first time in my entire life, I understood with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. The mirror in my chest reflected nothing at all, because there was nothing aimed at me but love, and that, I had finally learned, was the only kind of life worth building. Whatever came next, whoever tried to take it from me, the answer would always be the same. I would simply keep living, keep loving, keep doing no harm, and let the world sort the rest of itself out exactly as it always had. The morning light reached the balcony, and Vivian's shoulder rested warm against mine, and somewhere far away a broken woman was learning the lesson I had already learned, the slow, hard way that all true lessons are learned. I drank my coffee, and I held my wife's hand, and I let the quiet be enough. It was more than enough. After 7 years of silence as a shield, I had finally found a silence that meant peace, and I would not trade it for every empire on earth. People who hear my story sometimes ask whether I wish the power had come sooner, whether I mourn the 7 years I lost to a woman who never saw me. For a long time I did not know how to answer, but I think I understand it now, standing on this balcony with the city waking gold below me. The 7 years were not wasted, because they taught me precisely what a cage feels like from the inside, and only a man who has felt the cage can truly taste the freedom of the open door. If the power had come sooner, I might have used it as a weapon, might have become the very thing it was built to reflect, might have ruled instead of healed. It came at the exact moment I was finally ready to draw a boundary instead of swinging a sword. And that timing was not an accident, of that I am certain. The skill is a mirror, and a mirror shows you only what stands before it, and so the great secret of my life is the simplest one imaginable. If you wish to live untouched by cruelty, send no cruelty into the world, and surround yourself with people whose reflections you would be glad to wear. The wicked destroy themselves against the boundary, the kind pass through it freely, and the man in the center gets to choose, every single day, which kind of person he will be. I chose kindness, in the end, not because I am a saint, but because I had finally seen the alternative play out in the ruin of everyone who chose otherwise. Seraphina chose cruelty and it consumed her. Julian chose greed and it broke him. The executives chose deception and it exposed them. And I, standing in the wreckage they made of themselves, chose to drink my coffee, love my wife, do my quiet work, and let the mirror in my chest sleep the long, peaceful sleep of a man who sends nothing into the world that he would not want to receive. That is the whole of it. That is everything I learned. It was enough to build a life on, and the life at last was entirely my own. End.